It started with one story, our dads. But it's become something much bigger than we've ever imagined. Our World War II Dad began as a way to understand one man's service, and it grew into a mission to preserve the stories of those from an entire generation. From the soldiers of the 99th Infantry Battalion Separate in Europe, to the families waiting at home, to the children now carrying forward their fathers' and grandfathers' memories. These stories remind us of how sacrifice, courage, and dedication endure across time. This Veterans Day, we're honoring the legacy of World War II veterans through the voices of those who knew them best, their families. We'll revisit the stories of the men who could have stayed at home but chose to serve, the sons and daughters who continue to share their soldiers' journeys, and the story of our own father, Louis T. Cangilla, along with his brothers who also served. Looking at the calendar this time of year always brings a mix of memories. My dad's death anniversary, November 12th, falls right between two things he cherished: Veterans Day and our mom, who celebrates her 94th birthday this year on November 13th. Speaking of birthdays, and flipping back to this past summer, in June I had the honor of visiting South Elgin, a close-by town, to celebrate World War II Marine Bob Marshall's 100th birthday. Honoring a hero in person, sitting in a Willis Jeep just like the one Dad drove, and holding an M1 Garand rifle, also like Dad's, well, it all gave me pause. And that's the power of storytelling. It keeps memories alive, it connects generations, and it reminds us that behind every uniform is a human story worth remembering. So as we look back on this Veterans Day, join us in celebrating the people and the stories that continue to define who we are, and why remembering them matters. Hello everyone, I'm Chris Cangilla, and welcome to this special edition of Our World War II Dad. Today I'm without Ken, so I'm going solo, reflecting on some of the most remarkable people and moments we've shared throughout this podcast. As I said a few months ago, I visited South Elgin for a celebration honoring World War II Marine Bob Marshall on his 100th birthday. Not only was it great to thank a World War II veteran in person, while he's still here with us, but also I got to sit inside a Willis Jeep, just like the one Dad drove. I got to hold an M1 Garand rifle, like the one he carried, and I even got to see a World War II shovel, like the one we talked about that Dad had. Also on the grounds, I got to see a bicycle that reminded me of the ones that we saw in the World War II epic miniseries Band of Brothers, and there was a rationing exhibit showing the items just like the ones Mom described in our first episode. And it just really hit me. These stories aren't just stories from the past. They're the touchstones that connect us with who we really are. And that's what this episode's really about. Connection, legacy, and the people who remind us why these stories truly matter. Some of the World War II veterans we learned about during this series could have chosen to stay at home. They had families, important jobs, or deferments that would have kept them safe. But they didn't.
Wilbur is basically a rancher and a farmer, and he goes into the Army when World War II started in the South Pacific. And he was attached to G Company of the 35th Regiment of the 25th Infantry Division. And he probably could have deferred and not gone into the military because he's raising cattle and they're farming corn and wheat and oats. They're dryland farmers. And typically farmers, because they were providing for the soldiers and the country, they could defer their service. But he chose to go into the military. So G and E companies, and he's in G Company, they attacked on Pattison Ridge at 8:30 in the morning on April 14th, 1945, and they're on an island called Luzon in the Philippines. A Japanese sniper had climbed to the top of a tree on the hill beyond the crest where the Japanese were believed to be positioned and had fired a single 25 caliber steel-jacketed bullet. The bullet struck Sergeant Ball's rifle, broke his right collarbone, fractured his fifth right rib, punctured the upper lobe of his right lung, and perforated his right shoulder blade. Okay, so he's hit, and it was a glancing blow off the rifle, which probably saved his life. But he doesn't even go down. He runs to the rear where he knows he can get out of the rain of fire, right? So Ball is wounded, and in talking to Arlen, he's talking about his uncle. Arlen tells me that the timing of his wound happened that the hospital ship was already at capacity and had left the port on Luzon. So they load Sergeant Ball on a merchant marine vessel, which is basically a cargo ship, and they start sending him back to America on a merchant marine vessel. He finally comes back to Briggsdale, a wounded soldier, a Purple Heart recipient, and he has trouble, lifting his arm on the side where the rib's gone. And Arlen's grandpa, Wilbur's dad, recognizes that if this man's going to farm, he needs to be able to strengthen his arm. So Arlen's grandfather says to Wilbur, if you paint the barn, I will pay you a good wage, because he knew if he painted that whole thing by hand, it would build up his strength, which he did.
It's like the modern day Karate Kid,
Exactly.
Paint the fence, or whatever you're saying in there. He's doing that, getting him strong and healthy again. How did he turn out, Ken?
So he gains his strength, but he decides to use the GI Bill. He goes to Colorado State University and he gets his teaching certificate, and he got it in agriculture because that's his background.
Sure.
He goes on to get his master's and PhD, and he taught in the California university system as a professor, and goes on to live a great life, traveled the world, teaching about agriculture, lived a very full life, and came, this close to being killed in action. Luckily, his rifle saved him.
Yeah, what an incredible story. And here's a guy, right, that, is strong and obviously a survivor, that then when he comes back from the war, he uses his brain, right? He uses this other part of him that must be strong too. He must be a brilliant man. CSU is an incredible agricultural school, especially back then, and just gained all that knowledge, all the knowledge he already had from being on the farm for so many years. And really, just educated the world, because he traveled it afterwards. What an incredible story.
If you remember during our podcast, I had mentioned when we were talking about the age of soldiers, I had mentioned Woody Martin, who was a soldier in the Pacific that they called Gramps.
Yeah.
Okay. He enlists at about age 29. So he wasn't going to stay home. And he could have, because he was building army bases for a living. And so that was an essential employment as well. And he said, nope, I'm going. And he goes into the Army, and he's originally with the 40th Infantry Division. And then he's attached to the 3rd Battalion, 383rd Regiment, 96th Infantry Division. And he's in what's called JASCO, which stands for Joint Assault Signal Company. So these guys were pretty incredible. So JASCO's job was to be the forward artillery spotters for naval gunfire. So he worked in a 2-man unit, himself and a gentleman named George Kern, and they do this on a number of islands. They're on New Britain, they're on Leyte in the Philippines in October of 1944, they're on Luzon in the Philippines in January 1944, which is the same island Wilbur is wounded on. Yeah.
Right.
And then he's on Okinawa, 82 days on the line. He turned 32 on April 5th. So that's why he was called, Grandpa, fighting up to age 32 alongside guys that are 18 and 19. So he's Grandpa. So there's some really terrific photos of him, but the best photo is one I've admired for years that I've seen. And it's a picture of him and George Kern. And if you look at Woody, his pants are torn, he's dirty, he's skinny, and George is sitting in the Jeep, and the Jeep is covered in mud. And Chris, they had chains on the tire of the Jeep just from the quagmire that they were in because of all the rain they had there. And I look at that picture and I think about the South Pacific, and I'm like, wow, that was a theater of operations that was just intense. You're not only fighting the enemy, you're fighting the elements there.
It's like, it's so amazing because like in Europe, it was the cold, the Battle of the Balls. These guys are freezing in the snow, right? And then here in the Pacific, it's the mosquitoes and it's the heat and it's the mud and the rainforest. Ugh.
But man, I don't know, that South Pacific looks brutal to me.
My dad served in World War II in the Navy. He was a yeoman, which I found out is I guess the Army equivalent would be like private first class. He did mostly clerical work. In 1941, he got a job with a company called Morgenthaler, I believe, and they were a defense company. They made parts, I think, for artillery. And so he was exempt. He had an essential job. And so I don't think he thought about enlisting. And then as the war ramped up, and I think part of it was what he saw what was going on, and especially in Europe. And he had some hostile coworkers who, because he was Jewish, made comments that, well, you're here and we're fighting your war for you. So his receipt thought about it and he said, I'll tell you what, I'll go and enlist, and why don't you come with me? And of course, the person did not go with him, but I think it was a commitment that he felt he had to do. So
impressive. It seems like those bullies really never follow through. They're just cowards deep down inside. So
once he got over there, he told me that he met a lot of, there were several that were illiterate. And so he assigned himself the job of teaching them how to read. So that was part of what he did. And he also figured out very quickly that he was the only Jew in his troop. So he made himself the assistant to
help with the rabbi work, right, of that chaplain, if you will.
Chaplain, that's the word I was thinking of.
Yeah. It's amazing how that's what I love about these things. Like a chaplain did all the services for all the different denominations. So why can't we all just be like chaplains and just say, hey, this is all good, no matter what you are. Let's do it all together. That's terrific. Well, he sounds like such a wonderful man, and I'm glad that, you have these good memories and you're able to come on here and talk about us, because we got to tell these stories, right?
Absolutely.
You've lost your folks. I've lost my dad, and it's going to die with us unless we keep on getting it out there and sharing. So I can't thank you enough for sharing, your World War II dad with us.
Thank you. And thank you for doing this, because it's very important work and we need to remember.
Absolutely.
Each of those men had every reason to sit it out, but they didn't. And their courage continues to echo through every veteran who's ever said, "Send me." Now let's move on to a different kind of courage, the kind that keeps these stories alive. Over the past few years, Ken and I have had the opportunity to talk to some sons of World War II veterans. People like Erik Brun, Olaf and David Minge, Pattison, and Mikke Pierson. They remind us that every story, no matter how ordinary it seems, carries something extraordinary.
You probably wouldn't know any of this history about the 99th or studied the 99th if it wasn't for your dad, Christian Brun, one of the original members who served in C Company like our dad did, and was part of the first U.S. Army Guard detachment. So can you tell us about him and how he came to serve in the 99th Infantry Battalion separate?
There was an officer in the Military Intelligence Division who proposed to General Marshall that there's a way that we've got to reach out to these aliens because we can use them. And he very specifically came up with a plan to do that. And that involved changing laws. So aliens fell under selective service, but since they hadn't been registered for the draft, they had to do an alien registration for that. And that's what my father experienced when he had to go get fingerprinted. He reports back to Fort Lewis. They say something about, oh, you're Norwegian? That's okay, we got this. And next thing you know, he's on a train to Pando, Colorado, which was the train station siding for Camp Hale. And the 99th had just arrived at Camp Hale, and he had Christmas dinner in the barracks, in the mess halls there, surrounded by Norwegians, surrounded by people that looked like him. And this 99th Battalion, this 1,000 guys, doesn't fit in anywhere else. None of the 900 battalions in the American Army in World War II, almost all of them served as part of a regiment, as part of a division. It's like 98% of them. But the 99th was a separate. So at some point, the Army headquarters decides that they want a little more security for their headquarters in the field. So my dad was one of the ones selected for that. A handful of positions, like in the parking lot, as you come in, you would pass one of their guards and you'd be ID checked. And as you left the parking lot and you came into the actual compound itself, you'd get checked again.
And Erik, who was the highest brass that your dad was actually guarding at those headquarters?
Bradley and Hodges.
Wow.
Okay.
And so that was a 4-star command.
So that's a compliment to your dad, Erik, that he was really a shining star to get that assignment.
Yeah, but something that I really come to understand is that sometimes the compliments backfire in a way. I think for him it was the rest of his friends in C Company did go to the Canal Drive and did go to Versland and did go to the Bulge. One of his statements was that he kept asking to go, and the NCOs didn't want to release him. He had kind of a survivor's guilt from that. He didn't feel he was, he had been held back for a high prestige, because nobody wants the drunk guy showing up in front of the general, okay?
Right.
Much later in his life, I started reaching out to the people around him, and the things that they would say about an honorable, trustworthy, thoughtful man. I was growing up. I was a teenager. I was trying to get out, start my own life, and I miss being able to go back in the Wayback Machine and truly enjoy those things with my dad.
This is where Captain Fisher was killed.
Oh, okay.
There is a marker and a grave site, the initial or grave for Captain Fisher.
Wasn't your dad close by when he was killed? I think I read something that, that Raymond, it went and found shelter, but Fisher did not. And that's one of the reasons he was killed. I believe I read something along those lines.
These two doctors were together, and that some German artillery fire began to come into their area. My dad and the others went down in the basement of this building, and Fisher did not, and some of the shrapnel or fragments from this artillery fire killed Fisher instantly. My understanding that my dad was being transferred to a larger military hospital, and that Fisher was going to take his place as a medical doctor for the 99th. Well, of course, then that didn't happen.
In fact, Captain Fisher was assigned to the 99th on September 13th, and he was killed on September 16th.
Oh my goodness.
So he was only with the unit for a few days, and while not knowing directly, I'm sure that this weighed very heavily on my grandfather, David's father.
But I'm just struck with the fact that Raymond's path was changed due to this event, and he stayed embedded with the 99th throughout the rest of the war. And I'm sure the Norwegians were glad to have him since he was one of their own.
Normandy was tragic from several perspectives. For the Americans, the massacre was so impossible to understand. How would you shoot down 125 or more American soldiers essentially in cold blood? Just open fire, force them to line up, stand up, and kill them.
The massacre, of course, was a fatal event for nearly all of the men. There were just a couple that survived, and they did it largely. They were shot, but they played dead. And the German soldiers walked over and back and forth and shot multiple times, but somehow just a few men did survive. And one crawled out under cover of night, spent the night in a nearby barn, and then it was either the next day or the day after was stumbled upon by some soldiers of the 99th.
And your grandfather treated him, and as I read the story, the man's leg was shot so terribly, your grandfather wasn't sure if he was going to be able to keep it or not. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And
Eh,
he said that you're going home now, son. This is the end of
yeah.
your wartime. And he had that injury throughout his life. And so in the transcript of the interview with him, as an elderly gentleman, he was still having difficulties with his leg and going into the VA periodically for treatment and deep infection that lasted through his whole life.
But I'm really interested in learning about your World War II dad.
Well, thanks. So my dad, Raylan Pattison, he also went by Pat, which is my name, and he was a career officer. So he jumped into the military before December 7th, did all that we're going to talk about. So, and like your dad, I think, and like most of his generation, never talked about it. And I know you come up, guys, I've watched enough of the podcasts that you come up against that time and time again in terms of the stories. So, and when he did talk about it, it would be some silly anecdote kind of at his expense. It'd be a funny thing. He talked about, being constipated and, and just weird, just things that really you could just tell he wanted to shy away from the real gore. But this is a samurai sword.
Wow.
That he brought back from Japan that I would play with as a little kid. I mean, you can't believe the steel on this sword. And I thought, oh yeah, and you see all these, I don't know what they are, tourist gimmicky
samurai
sword.
Yeah.
And I this is heavy, and like I said, I mean, this is an amazing
The real deal.
And yet this was a toy for me as a kid, my brother and I,
Well, it's funny you say that because Ken, you wore Dad's army boots that he brought home to shovel snow in, right?
Yeah, I would put those things on and go out and shovel the snow, and they were not very waterproof. They weren't great boots, and they were not very comfortable. So I don't know how he marched all over Europe in those things, and his feet didn't just get destroyed.
Yeah. So he was in the Battle of Okinawa. Is one of the things Chris and I learned from Jack Luter. This little arrowhead is the symbol of having been a part of an amphibious landing. So he, and Okinawa was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific theater. And I looked up those battles, and just to give you a sense of how big they were. So 12,500 killed, 49,000 casualties on our side. 150,000 civilians were killed on Okinawa, and 110,000 Japanese defenders were killed in that battle. I mean, when you think that all of Vietnam was 50,000 men, these were single battles where half of that happened, or in the case of the Japanese, double that in one battle. So,
Yes.
The scope of World War II, I think, is lost on any of us that weren't there. It's just so big.
We're here to talk about your dad, Frank Romer Pierson, and he's got an incredible story. But I read that your dad's young life as a teenager was shared in a novel. Tell us about that.
So yes, his mother, she was a writer and actually a journalist, really. That's how I knew her anyhow. And she wrote a book called Roughly Speaking, which I have no idea how many copies it sold or didn't sell. I have absolutely no clue. Long before me. And it became a movie starring Rosalind Russell. It features little Frankie, my dad, and he was the youngest of the kids. So, I guess he comes from a writing family.
What was the premise of the story that she wrote about the family?
I just about her life and what they went through, and their adventures. Is just she had the ability to tell stories, and when I knew her when she was older, she was a journalist who covered human interest stories for a newspaper. Yeah, so that's just who she was.
That's crazy. And I also, in looking into this a little bit, found out that your dad, being the youngest of, I think he had two other brothers, when he was 17, went to enlist for World War II. And that's what was part of this story as well. And it struck a chord with Ken and I because our dad had four brothers himself. So, it's like the Saving Private Ryan we've talked about a lot. It's like, just can't imagine them sending brothers to the war like that. Your dad and his two brothers, our dad and his four brothers. It just seems kind of remarkable. And then you go in there further and you see in the story that your grandmother kind of reflects on how she, feels like maybe she failed, in some ways, her family, despite her past struggles. But then she realized that maybe in those past struggles, she made her sons, prepared for, taking on that task of joining the war. So do you know much about where he was or any of that kind of stuff?
He didn't talk a lot about it. I mean, I know he went through the Pacific. He said he ended up in Okinawa. He didn't talk about specific campaigns. He told stories, but I don't remember, not many, but I don't remember him really being very specific about where he was. Some of his stories are more, he's a storyteller. So some of his stories are more about the story than they are about the history,
What we did learn about your dad from some of his writings, that he was kind of frequently assigned to lead patrols behind the enemy lines there in the South Pacific. And in fact, I came across an article your dad wrote in 2004 for the LA Times, and it was titled "With Blood on Our Hands." And in that article, he reflected on some emotions that kind of resurfaced after reading about a story of current day U.S. Marines killing a wounded, unarmed Iraqi. It seemed like it brought up, some old feelings for him. And in this article that he wrote, he shares a personal story from his time in World War II about leading a three-man patrol behind Japanese lines in the South Pacific jungle near Idope, which I guess is on the coast of New Guinea. He writes that on these patrols, if they were spotted, they were instructed to kill anyone who saw them. Then they came across a Japanese officer. They see him sleeping, they think, near a waterfall. And as your dad and his patrol froze unnoticed, they realized that this officer could be a valuable, intelligent asset. And so they, decided, let's maybe capture him. But with just three men in such a hostile environment and so far in country, taking him prisoner would be virtually impossible. Your dad goes on to write in that article that the struggle that he felt, knowing that, the task at hand might have to be to kill that officer that they came across. And he wrestled with the idea of whether maybe they should wake the officer before killing him or do it while he slept, which is another just heart-wrenching, decision to make. And as your dad tells it, what seemed like forever, he finally motioned to his second in command to take the shot. He describes the moment so vividly, using the kind of language only a talented writer, could. And afterward, your dad wrote about inspecting the officer's body, his rusty weapon, the dirt and mud that covered his uniform and boots, and how thin he was, indicating that he's likely been surviving alone for a while out in the wilderness there. Then he looked through the officer's wallet and found a picture of a young, pretty wife, a boy of 5 or 6 years old, and an infant. So, Mikey, the way that your dad writes about this, he also mentioned that he felt such a deep sadness that never, really left him. What do you know about this event, and how did you think it shaped your dad?
I actually know nothing about the event itself, but certainly the impact on him, I believe, was huge. He was very much a very liberal pacifist, and it clearly came from, his life previous to coming to Hollywood, and he really cared deeply about the human condition. He liked to tell stories that had a lot of meaning about the human condition. And, some of his movies are pretty hard hitting.
Yeah, when I read that story, it really struck me on I wonder if he actually took the shot. And when he tells the story, he talks about somebody else taking the shot because it definitely had such a deep impact on him.
That's a great question, because he was a storyteller, and this, having heard many of his other stories, they seem to evolve and change, and often there was different versions depending on, when he told the story. So I don't know the answer.
No, we'll never know.
As we learned after the war, your dad, of course, got his degree in Harvard and, became a field correspondent for the Time and Life magazines. But then he kind of quit journalism and pursued Hollywood, so it's like he left that kind of life behind for maybe the fantasy part of telling those stories, right?
Yeah, exactly. And quite honestly, he was angry back when I was young, not at us. He never hit us or anything like that, but he had this just deep inner angst in general, drove like a maniac, got in arguments all the time, not fist fights, but a lot of arguments related to his work, disagreed with other people, directors, writers who were producers, particularly producers, I think. And that was very much a part of when I was a teenager, and it was hard to reconcile. He was hard to be around at times.
Yeah, I think about men of that era coming back from the war and how they processed all that. And then we, as their sons, were around them, but they had trouble communicating, at least in my personal case, really strong emotions towards us. It was more, I'm the disciplinarian, you're going to do it this way, and that's how it's going to be, and don't talk back about it, that kind of thing. So I just wonder, was that the generation, would they have been that way regardless of World War II, or was it because of World War II?
It's a great question. I think when you go through something as traumatic as what our fathers did, there's not one way to come out of it, So I think, I'm sure a lot of people drank themselves to death or became very rigid or just checked out entirely, or some version of all of that. Wouldn't surprise me.
And even the switch of being a violent person and maybe causing crime and stuff where they couldn't turn off that killer instinct too. But we digress a little bit on that part because we started talking about after the war. As we talked about after the war, he was a journalism, he quit that and he turned his, talents to Hollywood. And boy, he had a pretty successful run, among the many credits as a writer, director, and producer. Your dad was nominated for an Oscar for screenwriting the film Cat Ballou in 1965, starring Jane Fonda in the title role, and Lee Marvin, who won the Best Actor Oscar for his role. He also co-wrote the screenplay for Cool Hand Luke in 1967, starring Paul Newman.
Can I show you something quickly?
Of course.
This is something he actually treasured. This is cool. A Jim Davis Garfield. My dad was a huge fan, and signed by Jim for my dad because it's got his line in it. And my dad treasured this.
Wow, that is awesome. So Jim put that into his strip.
It says, "What we have here is a failure to communicate."
So just as your dad wrote it. So your dad would be very proud. Then I guess your dad just kept on having the success, and he went on to win an Oscar for Best Writing Original Screenplay in 1975 for Dog Day Afternoon, starring Al Pacino. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's the 50 years since he wrote that movie coming up. He was in a very big part of his career. He was incredibly busy, to be honest. We didn't see him a lot. He and my mom had split up. He was probably just absolutely impossible to live with then. Matter of fact, I'm just pretty darn sure he was. So he was gone a lot. I mean, I saw him at times, but like I said, I avoided him a little bit. He wasn't angry at me. He was just a handful. Let's put it that way. Living a pretty counterculture life, driving his Porsche at about 120 miles an hour average, it seemed, and just a bit on the nutty creative side. So during that whole period with Cool Hand Luke, through Dog Day Afternoon, and even further, yeah, there was a lot he was processing. I'm born January 3rd, 1960. So I qualified for selective service by 3 days when they started that back up. And at the time, I was pretty countercultural myself. That was 1978. And I did not want to sign up for selective service. My dad wrote an article about my decision, which was published in the LA Times and I believe the New York Times, supporting my decision and talking about the story of him going into World War II. He talks about that and supports me, which was an interesting moment for me. I'm, barely knowing who I am, and I had thousands of people writing me hate mail suddenly. So that was an unusual experience, but it's certainly he put it out there how he felt.
And he had a right. Yeah, and he had a right to say the things that he wanted to because he did see that action in World War II. So it was kind of like comparing and contrasting to what was going on, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. Big time. And I think he wanted to stir up that conversation more. I mean, not that it wasn't already happening, but, that was a conversation he wanted to push forward.
And I'm sure he saw those conflicts as two very different types of conflicts. When he went into World War II, I think he really did feel that America was under threat versus Vietnam, where you question, do we have any business even being over there? And good for him for supporting you and for voicing those opinions clearly.
Yeah, no, that was nice. So yeah, he stuck to what he believed in, and he was good with it at whatever the cost. Mm-hmm. And there was often a cost outside of just our relationship, just, him in the entire industry, he was a battler.
Mm.
My dad, Louis T. Cangilla, served with the 99th Infantry Battalion Separate, but he wasn't alone. His brothers, Steve, James, John, Marcy, and his brother-in-law, Dick, all served during World War II. Each had their own story, their own journey, and their own reasons for answering the call. Ken, you researched Dad's steps overseas. You recently got back from seeing some of those areas in France, Belgium, Germany, and Norway. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So I've always had the desire to really follow in his footsteps and understand what it was like for him when he was an 18-year-old and in the Army. And so I had the opportunity, after having done years of research at home, to go to Europe. And I had some great people to kind of guide me along the way, and did some great research before we left, and was able to really see exactly where he was and understand the action that took place on those battlefields that he participated in 1944 and 1945.
Yeah, his world was turned upside down as many men his same age just changed overnight. Everybody had hopes and dreams and things that they were going to do, and it completely changed. Mm-hmm. It seems like we need to learn more about what that time in America was like. We need to talk to somebody who was actually alive and there during that incredible time in our U.S. history. Let's go to our mom. Well, joining us now is our World War II mom. Mom, I can't thank you enough for doing this. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you, and thank you for asking me to come.
Mom, it's great to have you on here with us. We got a lot of questions for you about the good old days, so I hope you're ready for some good answers for us.
I will do my very best.
Now, Mom, you didn't know Dad when he actually shipped off to the war, right?
I was 10 years old and in 5th grade when your dad went into the service. So I didn't know him at all.
Mom, how did you first learn about the atrocities that started in Hawaii with Pearl Harbor?
My sister Doris and her boyfriend then had gone to the movies. When they came out, they were selling extra papers, and it said that we were at war. And when they came home, they told us all about it. Of course, we knew then that her boyfriend, Dick, was going to be going into the service. He went into boot camp, and he was gone for 6 weeks. And my sister Doris went to Mass every morning, and hopefully that he would be in the right place at the right time. Well, they sent him to Africa. And from Africa, they sent him to Italy. And the boy never got home for 3 years. Mm. My sister wrote to him every single day.
So, Mom, you guys learned about, the start of the war pretty much from the extra and the newspapers that they brought home. A lot of Americans would reach out to servicemen, really make sure that they're sending them care packages and making sure that they're known that they're loved at home and that kind of stuff. Did your family take part in that at all?
Well, my sister Doris did. And she would make cookies, she would make brownies, and my dad would package them up so carefully and send them off to her boyfriend, Dick. Well, this one time she used my mother's mixer. And the next day, my mother went to use the mixer, and a metal nut was missing from the mixer. My sister immediately wrote to Dick, and fortunately, he got the letter before he got the brownies. So when the brownies came, he and his buddies took their little fingers and sifted through all the brownies until they found the metal nut. And he was in Italy at the time, and he mailed it back from Italy.
So at least you can keep that mixer working, even if it's all the way to Italy and back.
Yes.
And quite a few nuts obviously came from Italy, since that's where our ancestry's from.
There you go.
There you go. It's Comedy Central right here. Yeah. What do you remember about victory in Europe, victory in the war? What do you remember about that happening and the boys coming home?
Boy, that was wonderful. As I said, my brother-in-law, Dick, was in for 3 years. When he called Doris and said, I'm on my way home, but we didn't know exactly when he was going to be home. And so she waited and waited and waited for another call. And she had to run an errand. So she did. And when she came back, we were all hustling around in the family room and getting ready to go somewhere. She said, where are you all going? We're going down to the train station to pick up Dick. Wow. So we went and picked up his mother. And my dad said to my sister, you let his mother hug and kiss him first, which she did. So they dated for, I don't know, a year and a half, and then they got married.
So you can appreciate that, being a mother of 8 kids, that you would probably want to hug your son before any of our
That's right.
do.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah. So it was nice.
Yeah, I'm just impressed with your memory, Mom, and always have been. Tell people how old you are right now. I'm
91. I'll be 92 in November.
And Ken and I hope we get your genes.
Yeah. I want to hold on to my jeans for a while.
All right. You may still need to wear them, right?
Yeah.
You told me that there were 1 million soldiers, or troops, I should say, on both sides of this war during the Battle of the Bulge. So that area must have been just overrun with a ton of soldiers from all different branches, right?
Yeah, they were called in from every parts of Europe to reinforce at the Bulge. So they came from everywhere and were spread out all along that area, from really Malmedy kind of at the top all the way down below Bastogne at the bottom. Yeah, so there's soldiers everywhere. But lo and behold, something really interesting happens. Dad's in Belgium. And his brother James, who's I think 5 years older than he is, he's with the 28th Signal Corps, and I believe they were fighting just a little bit south of Dad's positions. And somewhere in Belgium, he runs into his brother, and they have an opportunity to take some pictures together. And what a homecoming that must have felt like, to have been gone, since 1943. You're this young man. You run into your older brother, which has got to feel good, right? You like older brothers, right, Chris?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. I don't get to run into you other than every week on this podcast, but I'd like to see you in person.
Right. Yeah. So he runs into his older brother out in this field somewhere in Belgium. I don't know how it happened, if they got wind that each other's companies were there. And so they get a chance to reunite. And it's one of my favorite photos that I found going through his things, because Dad's standing there next to his taller brother, and Dad's flicking him on the helmet, just jacking around instead of like taking the tough guy pose, And it just really, to me, captured the joy in that reunion.
Yeah, I saw that photo, and I thought that Dad was trying to measure that he was, maybe growing a little bit on his older brother, but now he was flicking his helmet. Why not, right?
Right, right. I mean, it's just perfectly, what you would expect from brothers. And so
It's
what a reunion that must have been.
it's so cool. We discussed in an early episode of this series that dad and his four brothers, I should say, all served in World War II. And in fact, they made the newspaper in their hometown of East Liberty, Pennsylvania. What an incredible time that was.
Yeah, that article in the East Liberty paper was June 16th, 1944, which was 10 days after D-Day happened. So it's an article showing these five brothers all over the world fighting in different theaters. And of course, Dad runs into Jamie. But there's another story and another short newspaper article that came out in the Pittsburgh area. Jamie runs into John in France, and I don't know exactly when it happens, but it's probably shortly after running into Dad. So there's another reunion, and I have the old article. I found it when I went through Dad's things. I'm just gonna. It's really short, but I'll just read a couple things. Yeah. So it says, two of the local boys are in the European theater. They were united at the front somewhere in France, according to a letter received by their father. Corporal John F. Cangilla wrote his father that last month, while he was resting in a bunk at his camp, he saw when he looked up, he saw his brother, Corporal James Cangilla, who was serving in the same division but with a different unit several miles away. Each knew the other was in the same area, but they never had run into each other before, and it was their first meeting in nearly 3 years.
That's just remarkable. But there's more of these chance meetings, isn't there?
Yes. It goes one step further even. So the South Pacific holds Dad's brother. We called him Uncle Maurice. He's an ordnance man, so he loads bombs, okay? And his brother Dad's brother Steve is in the Navy in the South Pacific. And Uncle Marcy's on Tinian Island. And Uncle Steve's ship pulls into Saipan. And so somehow Steve gets word that Marcy's just an island away, and Steve's ship was in for repairs. So I don't know how he island hopped, but he got there. So he gets over to Marcy's side and pops in to see him. And there's an interesting article about Marcy that came out 20 years later. And in that article, Marcy says there were two things that really meant a lot to him when he was overseas. He says one was, I was one of the guys that loaded one of the atom bombs. So from a historical standpoint, that was very significant. He goes, the other thing that was special to me is my brother Steve walks in and says, "Hiya, bud. How you doing?" And he goes, I knew his ship was over in Saipan, but he goes, had no idea I'd run into him. And so he ranked that right up there with a historical event, running into his brother. So that really got me curious. I go down one rabbit hole for Dad. Now I'm looking at the other brothers, trying to dig up some more information. And so I got to thinking, okay, this is a historical event, right? I mean, this is a big, big deal. So I get on YouTube and I just start looking for footage. I'm like, they have to film this. And sure enough, I find some footage, and there's like a 3-part series about it. And each one, there's no sound. Each one's about, 10 minutes long. So I go through the first one, I don't see him. Go through the second one, I don't see him. Go through the third one, and they're loading. I can see that it's the shape of the bomb's different. Okay, so this is Fat Man.
Right.
A little boy was the first one. Fat Man's the second bomb, and it's a lot rounder for some reason. So I'm like, this is the right bomb. So it shows these guys loading it. And Uncle Marcy was a heavier man. He had a very round face, and he carried a little bit extra weight. And it's probably why he was on the ordnance crew, because he's probably a big, strong guy. But he wasn't really the fittest guy to be running up and down hills.
Sure.
So I'm looking for a guy that's a little heavier, right? So I watch these guys. They load the bomb, and it was very technical how they had to do it. And they have to get it on a truck, and they have to truck it out to the airfield. And driving it out to the airfield is this tractor trailer, and the front passenger side door is open. And this is from a long ways away, and then it gets a little bit closer. Front passenger side door is open, and there's a man, standing up and looking above the door, and he's got this round face. And Chris, I look at the photo in the newspaper and I look at the video on YouTube, and it's got to be Uncle Marcy. So the stories were true. He loaded the atom bomb. So effectively, Uncle Marcy was able to, help end the war in the Pacific by loading that ordnance, and he found his place
along
in history.
with his 4 brothers and their jobs and all the other brothers out there in the service, because they all work together for sure. The first thing I want to talk about, they had a 1943 Willis Jeep, and we've talked a lot about that. And my goodness, looking at that Jeep, I can just imagine and see Dad in that Jeep, because he drove many of the, COs around, his commanding officers. So that was his main job, right? Being a Jeep driver or a truck driver, they said, as well as an infantryman.
Yeah, I think he graduated to that. I think when he first joined the 99th, he was assigned as a runner, delivering messages from point A to point B, and that was a dangerous job. And then I think as he became more seasoned, somehow he fell into the opportunity to drive the Jeep. They call it a light truck in his papers, but they're referring to the Jeep. So yeah, he moved up into that, and I'm sure he welcomed that opportunity to be able to drive and not walk as well.
Yes, and you mentioned him being a runner, and we really got to see what we think the areas that he ran in when you did your trip to Oversland, right? And you were with the guide Volker, and he took you around. And let's just kind of relive some of that, because that was an amazing part of your journey in Europe.
So Volker gets me in the Jeep, and we take off through Worsland. And he had a bunch of old black and white photos that he had researched. And the first photo he shows me is this American soldier. And I don't know if he's in Dad's company or not, but in his research, he knew Dad's company had come through this same place. So it could be a member of the 99th. We're not sure, but this is American soldier, and he's in the doorway, and it's kind of a sunken doorway. It must be like go down to a basement doorway. He's in the doorway of this building, and he's got his gun out, and he's looking up the road, and the building's brick with this red trim on it and everything. And so he drives us up there, and he stops the Jeep, and he goes, look to your left. And I looked to my left, and Chris, the building had not changed a bit. I mean, some of the grass had grown up differently, and there might be a fence here and there, but the building was unchanged. That doorway was unchanged. And I walked over there and stood right where that soldier was. And Volker tells me what the soldier's looking at is a tank that's up the road. He has a picture of the tank up the road as well. So it was great to be able to see that building exactly as it was. And it's a knocked out German tank. It's smoke still coming out of it. And in that picture, there's 2 soldiers, one on the right hand side in the hedges, kind of looking up, is it safe to move up? And then another soldier's on the left hand side of the street, behind the building, kind of looking around. And one of the interesting things that occurred to me when I was there is do you remember Dad telling the story about when, he was what they called a messenger? That's in his paperwork, and it shows that he was a messenger and then a Jeep driver. So as a messenger, they're called runners. And so what a runner does is he's given a message by the command to say, hey, take this message, you got to get it down to this sergeant and tell him this is what we want him to do. So Dad's got this message, and he tells the story that he was ready to take it. So he inquires where the guys are, and somebody goes, yeah, they're down this way. And Dad says, okay, have we cleared this sector? Is this a good route to go? And the guy goes, yeah, you're fine. Go ahead and, go down that way. So Dad says he took off running. And this is what I pictured in my mind when I was at this location. He takes off running, and there's houses on one side and a field on the other side. He's running right along the houses, and a machine gun from on the other side of the field opens up on him. And he just hears, that sound of that MG-42 coming at him. And he said the first doorway he got into, the door was open, and he just dove in to get safety. What he didn't realize is it was a door to a basement, just like that picture of the man standing in the doorway. That was a basement door. He dived straight out, but there's stairs going down. So, you dive this way, but the ground's dropping below you. So he dove all the way into the basement. He hurt his wrist or his thumb at the time. And I said, what did you do? He goes, I kind of waited till it got dark. And he goes, after it got dark, I was able to move up the street and deliver the message. But I remember as a kid when we'd ride on his back and he'd give us piggybacks. Yeah, he would never put his hand flat on the ground. He'd always make a fist because that wrist hurt him. And that's why that wrist always bothered him. So those are the memories that flooded back to me when I pictured him in that same situation as that soldier in the doorway at 18. Maybe he ran up that road. It was probably a road similar to that where they opened up, firing at him, and he did what his instincts said to do, which was to dive in the first opening you could get to and hide out.
Yeah, the basement, not knowing that was a basement and diving in there. No wonder, like I said, Dad kind of used his fist when he'd give us piggyback rides because he hurt his wrist diving into that basement back in that time. Back in the museum in the Boeing Center, we came across the CCKW hardtop vehicle, and that looked really familiar to me as well. It was like a troop transport kind of truck because it made me think of a video that we saw. Can you explain what we saw in the video and what this truck could be?
Yeah, those trucks, I think the guys referred to them as the deuce and a half because they were 2.5 ton trucks. And they moved a lot of troops on wooden benches. And you and I both dig through the YouTube videos all the time. And I saw that one video from Maastricht, which was where the canal drive took place. And there's even a sign in the background that shows Maastricht. And these soldiers are going by. And I swear this soldier in the back that flicks his cigarette ashes looks just like Dad, the same build, the same mannerisms. So it could very well have been him. We might have actually got a glimpse of our World War II Dad in the back of one of those trucks.
Yeah, those trucks, just to see one up close and personal. And then after looking at that video, it's like, yeah, that definitely could have been him in there.
Yeah.
And it's like I said earlier, we're striving to just find more stuff about Dad, and I wanted to walk around the corner and see a photo of him, in the field. But seeing that truck, that was kind of cool, and because that, it may not be that one, but he definitely was riding around in them because that's how they got around.
Yeah.
So my burning question is,
yeah.
Did you just happen to park in the same area that this all took place?
Well, that's what's interesting is, we're in this parking lot and it's a bus stop now where this building is. And I'm looking at the building, and I've been in Europe long enough to recognize what train stations look like because they live by the train there.
Sure.
And I'm looking at the bus depot, and it's a train station, you can tell. And then there's a walking path that is perfectly straight, and it's on the maps. It's called Line 45. Ligne is how they spell it, Line 45. And as you look at it, you can clearly see that that's where the railroad tracks were. They've been torn up, turned into a walking path and a bike path. And we're literally parked a grenade throw away from where those railroad tracks are. Now, I don't know if Dad was exactly there, but he was awfully close to that spot.
And you could have picked any place to pull in for the night that offered, the RV parking, and you happen to pick this one. Do you ever get the sense, and it's kind of spiritual in a way, but do you ever get a sense that Dad's finger is on your back, kind of guiding you where to go?
You have to wonder about that. For one thing, I had repeated these stories to my son, Kyle. He goes, Dad, it's gravity. He goes, Grandpa's pulling you via gravity to those locations. He goes, it's got to be something like that. So he echoed your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely.
So somebody must have got a camera along the way, because I find a lot of photos from kind of this time through the end of the war that Dad was able to get snapshots on, and they're in his belongings. So I come across this one photo, and it just really struck me. It's him leaning up against what I think is a tank destroyer. I'm not an expert on these vehicles, but it looks like a tank destroyer. And he's leaning up against a tank destroyer with who I believe is Captain Tom Scadam, who was, his commander for C Company. And it's just a great picture. Dad's got a cigar. He's got his head cocked, and he just looks, Chris, like a different man. You can tell he's grown up. He's experienced the war. He's experienced a lot of things that as that 18-year-old wide-eyed kid from Pittsburgh had no idea he was going to walk into. And so I went back and I compared it to a picture I have from a newspaper that was taken of him in a stag line, which is to dance with the local gals, and it's taken in Camp Croft. So he's just
a kid
in the service. You look at the comparison of the pictures, Chris, and it's not a great picture, Dad, because it's taken from kind of a weird angle and stuff. but he looks so young. And then I look at him. Here it is, 43. That was like spring of 43. Yeah, it's like 2 years later, spring of 45. He's in Barneville, France, and he's got a swagger to him and just looks fit, and he looks tough. It's just really kind of neat to look at.
Toughened by the war and the conditions he had to live under, and what he had to experience, for sure. You know, it's so funny that you say this and how young these guys are, because every time I think about World War II, and prior to us having this discussion, I always think of these guys as, in my mind, in their 30s. That's what I see them at. You know, when you watch these movies or whatever, you see them at their 30s. And maybe it's because they had such responsibility and they knew how to act and they take charge kind of guys, that I made them more mature. But they're 18, 19. Probably most of them are, under 22, 23 maybe? Yeah. You know, the majority of it. So it's remarkable that I really have to think about that here's my dad, you know, this hardened guy from war, this tough guy, and he's 20 years old. He's 19, whatever he is.
Yeah. So Dad's in the southern part of Germany, in a town called Regensburg, which is right on the Danube. You've seen these river cruises. They go right through Regensburg now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So Dad's stationed in Regensburg. And of course, you know, word spreads slowly, and then there's going to be some devout Nazis that aren't going to give up. So they carefully have to work their way through these towns. So they're in Regensburg, and Dad gets an interesting call of a mission he needs to go on. And rather than hear it from me, let's hear it from the old man himself. Here's Dad talking about his mission in Regensburg.
There was a Crown Prince Joseph of Austria. He was up in the mountains in Austria, and we were in Regensburg, which is just over the border from Austria. So myself and the lieutenant and I think one other rifleman were in the Jeep, and we went up there to help him, because he had some displaced persons that were getting rowdy, you know, Russians or something like that. And we had to get them out of there. They maybe harmed him or something like that. So we went up to the mountains, took a drive up to the hills. And while we were there, this Crown Prince Joseph came out of the cabin, a log cabin, you know, big fancy cabin. He had a long leather coat on. And he, I don't know whether he brought the gun or one of his servants brought the gun, but he brought this pistol I have, you know. It's an Italian Beretta, 32 caliber. And it had never been fired. So we drew lots for it, and I won it. And then we got rid of the Russian displaced persons. And we went back to our camp in Regensburg, and that's when the war was over. We were in Regensburg, Germany. It's down on the Danube River in southern Germany, right at the Austrian border.
To see Dad talk about displaced persons and tell us those war stories, I mean, that video is a real treasured piece of history for us, because it's one of the last times that Dad really told us those World War II stories, because that was shot in 96 and Dad did pass in 97. So, you know, we're on our own for this quest, and gosh, I wish the old man was around. It'd make our jobs a lot easier, right?
Yeah, it sure would. Yeah.
Learning about these men not only helped me understand who my dad was, but also the strength and sacrifice that kind of ran through our family. These men, they're not just family, they're a reminder of the kind of quiet duty that helped build this country. And that legacy, well, that's what our World War II Dad is really about. Across every episode of our World War II Dad, there's a pattern I've noticed. Ordinary objects that hold extraordinary meaning. A prayer card, a jacket, a shovel, a photograph. These simple things carry the weight of history, and they remind us that storytelling is what keeps memories alive. So this Veterans Day, if you have a story, whether it's your father's, your grandfather's, your grandmother's, or your uncle's, share it. Email us at info@ourworldwar2dad.com. That's OURWW2DAD.com. And help us keep these stories living, breathing, and inspiring.
because the greatest honor we can give our veterans is to make sure their stories never fade away. Thank you to all who have served and to their families for carrying their legacies forward. I'm Chris Cangilla, and this is Our WWII Dad.
Thanks for watching and listening to Our WWII Dad. Please remember to like and subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss an episode.
And if you're just listening to the podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. We would really appreciate it.